James Sörling. He is a manager of development and a fairly serious open source committer, specifically in the cloud native security space. And James is going to talk a lot about himself and a lot about his progress, but James is going to start out by telling us about his favorite superhero. James, it's all you.
So I have a martial arts background, so I like both Elektra and the Devil. They're not the superheroes per se, but they're still part of the Marvel universe. So I think they classify.
Right. So Daredevil, he's blind, right? Yet he has all this extra sensory perception. Or I don't know if it's not ESP, I don't know what it is, but he's able to sense things and not only block things but attack. To me, it seems like there's maybe an analogy for security, and of course, Elektra, she's good with those. I don't know what those kung fu knives are that she uses, Ginsu knives to slice and throw. But maybe there's a security analogy in there somewhere. Is that what you think? Or
you don't want to be like rubber hose crypto. Just beat up a nerd to get the password right.
Right. Well, very cool. Very good. Well, with that, I thought we would start out with just talking a little bit about you and your background. So I like to start with people knowing a little bit about your career, kind of where you started, and how you got to where you are now as a security architect. So please.
So my background is really like Spectrum, Atari, and I also had like a bulletin board system in the early 90s connected to FeedNet. FeedNet was sort of a precursor to news groups and the email, I would say. And also back then, it wasn't called open source. It was more freeware and shareware and also public domain source code. So, and then, so then I was like 10, 12 when I started this. And then I studied computing science. Moved to London, started working there for 7 years. So I worked for like a mobile game company, worked for another company with so different type of startups basically. One startup with a lot of people from Sequent and Tivoli, IBM people. So even around 2000, even the CTO was running Linux, for example. So it was a different climate in London compared to Sweden, where everybody was just running Windows.
Right. That's where you are now. You're in Sweden now.
Yeah, I'm in Sweden now.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So you got your start as really a hacker as a young person early on. I heard Atari. Of course, that was I remember when I got my Atari for Christmas. It was awesome. This is a long time ago. But then you progressed into, you studied computer science. I think you got your master's, as I recall. And you were doing a lot of consulting too, as well, working for startups. I saw a lot of consulting. So tell me, how did you go from being really a hardcore developer, working on what we'd call early open source, to now being a security architect? Maybe you can tell me about how you made that transition, why, and all that.
So I think for many developers, the transition just from developer to architect is quite hard. But I work with some experienced people from investment banking doing a few startups attempts. And I think once you sort of have to build things from scratch, you sort of get to the next level. But I got into security later. I started with working with Amazon Web Services around 2008. So that quite early, and then 2010 I started as first employee at a cloud security startup. So two guys that actually sold the first security startup to Gemalto.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I sort of got more into security, started building their security platform and deploying it securely to AWS.
All right. So. Continue.
Yeah, so, and I also had the opportunity to work with. We hired some more people with sort of network and firewall experience, and it's a small company, so I got more into that as well, basically, and also more operations and IT and like monitoring and surveillance of security.
Okay, so I can already hear what's leading to CFN-nag, but maybe you can tell me about how you ended up being a committer to that, and then obviously how you ended up then doing the module, the open source module that you wrote for SonarCube.
Yeah. So I work at Wireless Car, and we work with connected cars for most of the major car manufacturers like Volvo. Now it's partly owned by Volkswagen, but we also have Nissan, Land Rover, ELR. But I would say it's really Volkswagen that started. They used to have their own security standard, but then they sort of migrated to use NIST 853. And we had, I would say the problem was that we using AWS config rules, we detect a lot of compliance already deployed into the account, and it's a bit too late. So we initially started using CFN-nag to try to detect things before it was deployed. But then you had the problem, how do you handle false positives and things that you don't really want to fix? And back then, the only option was to add meta info to your CloudFormation stacks. So that wasn't really easy to handle. So that's why I wrote the SonarCube CloudFormation plugin, just to sort of get the issues into SonarCube to increase the visibility and also have an audit record of if somebody set something to false positive or won't fix, for example, you could see who was logged in and actually changed it.
So this is really when people talk about shift left, the security world is fond of creating words sometimes that don't mean anything, but I'd say in this case it actually does mean something. So in short, you had a compliance issue amongst other things. Working for Wireless Car, you're supporting serious companies that are doing serious global business at scale, and you had, in this case, it sounds like NIST 853 controls, and it was difficult to produce secure and compliant clouds. Once things are deployed, it was too late, too difficult. So you started investing in CFN-nag, yet still that was very difficult because while you were starting to shift left a little bit with that, the problem is that you were having false positives. So you went ahead and you already committed to CFN-nag. You decided to create a module using SonarCube, which your developers are using. So again, we're getting a very shift left here where you're talking about where the developers are, writing code. They're on their laptops. They're doing, they're the developers, DevOps, whatever. They're making, cloud infrastructure. They're defining cloud infrastructure, and you basically moved all of that over onto them right where they're working, right in real time, so that they can catch the mistakes and even address what might be a false positive right there in development in real time. So I'd consider that what I'm hearing is you actually orchestrated a complete shift left. And my question for you then is, in terms of the developers at Wireless Car, how well has this been received?
So we already introduced SonarCube before we started using CFN-nag. So they were quite used to that pattern. And I think one of the other things that, for example, if you find like an unencrypted S3 in our AWS account, maybe everything should have tagged with the team and the owner, but a lot of cases tag was missing. So then you sort of have to say that I know somebody deployed, but I can't find which stack.
Right.
So which like GitHub repo does this S3 buckets been connected to? So that's why to detect it while the CI/CD pipeline builds that stack, it's a lot easier to find the correct resource as well.
Right, right. So being able to basically say, because again, in security right now, what's really popular is cloud security posture management. That's scanning in runtime, but there's no awareness typically of the tags, of the the resources, ownership. It's just a complete black box. And what I'm hearing is you were able to then to resolve that again by being able to you take care of the tagging in development with, I don't know if you guys use Jenkins or what you're using, but being able to bring all that context together in one place, you're again able to really continue to shift security left and get in front of things. And I think that's awesome. And I think it's honestly still a huge unsolved problem in the security market. So with that, I'm going to ask next question here is, so
I just have one more thing as well that also connected to the security standard, that once we have these rules in SonarCube, for example, I also added the NIST 853 grouping to the different rule set. So SE8 for like encryption in transit, for example, just to be able to give the developers a connection to a security control that we have to implement.
How was that received? Are they getting it? Is it making sense?
So I didn't have it initially, and also when it comes to sort of audit perspective, to be able to show auditors that we do have these controls in place, and we could group them by these controls, and we could look at how many issues and in what projects we have issues. So it also helps to provide some proof.
So for audit, yeah, this is critically important. And for those listeners out there who maybe haven't worked in a large, conglomerate or supported one like Peter's doing, James Peter is doing, that is key, because audit can be really disruptive to development, to DevOps, to SRE. Audit will come in and they'll spin a wheel sometimes and say, prove to me you're doing X, Y, and Z. And when it comes to things like development, again, going back to the idea of traceability between the control, the actual runtime instantiated cloud resources, all the way to the development process, being able to tie that together with a specific control, very difficult. And it sounds like what I'm hearing is you've solved that. You've made it easier to go through audit and make audit much more painless, is what I'm hearing. Is that about right?
Yeah, for a subset of controls that are more tied directly to one type of AWS resource, for example.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So, security, as I've said, is historically really struggled with getting security capabilities integrated into development. I mean, I believe it's really struggling now with the advent of cloud native, right? I was just reading actually about Spotify. So I was a CISO at Twilio, and so years ago we were doing 20, 30,000 releases a year.
Yep.
Spotify does 20,000 deployments a day, right? And so I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to brag about what happened at Twilio 5 years ago. It's so irrelevant compared to the new speed. So, as a developer turned security architect, what are you seeing that works? I mean, it sounds like what you're doing is working. What's working? And what are you seeing as some of the gaps that need to be addressed, that are real challenging, particularly as it relates to, again, high velocity, continuous integration, continuous deployment, cloud native, et cetera?
Yeah. I would say, so I'm a security architect for about 15 teams, but I don't have any of my own developers or resources. So yeah, I would say it's still just basic hygiene stuff to get developers to make maintenance a priority. But I get them. They're trying to deliver business value. The customers are pushing for deadlines. So I think I would say that a subset of the teams are doing a great job, and then it's always a few teams that are sort of slightly behind. But I would say managing buy-in I think it changed a lot now since Borgfire took over the company, because they seem to really value security. But I think you can't really do it bottom up. It has to come from the top. I think that's the big challenge, to get management to see that they have to be sort of engaged and involved in security.
Right. Well, that makes sense. But I guess where I'm hearing from you as well, though, while you're one you're a powerhouse, but you're one guy. You're
Yeah.
you're designing and deploying tools. You're making things that make the lives of developers easier in a meaningful way. So I think it's both. I think you're again, as a CISO coming from cloud native environment, I mean,
Yeah.
I can't agree with you more. It takes the top down, but the types of things that you've done in terms of contributing to open source,
Yeah.
and then creating open source solutions that work with some of the commercial solutions you guys are using. I mean, I think that's gold. So we've already talked about this a little bit. You work in the, you work in, over there across the pond, right? You're in the
Yeah.
EU. And you've consulted for conglomerates. You mentioned, you're working for Wireless Car that has some support for VW, Volvo, what have you. So how acceptable and/or desirable is open source security solutions within these larger enterprises? When you look at not just, VW and not just
Yeah.
Volvo, but in the EU in general, how acceptable is open source? Is it highly desired? Is it frowned upon? Maybe you can tell me about that.
I would say everything we build is built on open source. So all third-party libraries are open source. We use a lot of like Elasticsearch, Kibana, Nginx. I would say if you look back 15 years, people had to buy a lot of this stuff like middleware. Now I would say all of the middleware is offered commodity open source. And even very rarely we pay for support. But Wireless Car where I work is about 500 people in US, China, and Sweden. So it's very different from the Volkswagen Group. Even if you're part of Volkswagen Group, there are about 500,000.
Right. Yeah, it's a big company. The reason I bring it up is here in the United States, if you were to go to a large, I mean, so I worked for a Fortune 10. I worked for
Yeah.
GE I ran security for their healthcare division, which is a very large healthcare organization globally. While there are pockets of people using open source, for the CISO to say, yeah, we're going to have an open source strategy and we're going to deploy open source for all of our security stuff, for all this healthcare stuff. I mean, listen, Wireless Car sounds pretty important, right? In terms of its role in safety and whatnot. Same obviously with healthcare. There has been a lot of reticence about open source. The knee-jerk reaction, particularly in security, as a buyer, would be, oh, I'll go to the Palo Alto networks, right? Or I'll go to the FireEye, or I'll go to pick your large name. Now that the engineers, the security engineers, totally bought in on open source, no question, and people like myself, obviously. But the buying habit and the perception still is very, very tightly coupled with enterprise. What I'm hearing you say is that it's a bit different in the EU. Is that right?
No, I think when it comes to like firewalls or hardware, there are still the commercial solutions that we use as well. But just when it comes to building application or setting up servers, I think majority of stuff is open source. But I think it changed a lot as well the last few years, I think, as well. So now, from a developer perspective, you're allowed to choose like Linux, Ubuntu, Mac OS, or Windows machine.
Right.
But you could basically use whatever you want, but it's still managed laptops.
Right. That makes sense. So this is my last question, and this is very much more of a technical question as it relates to cloud native development in particular. So you already talked about the organizational challenges, right? You need to bring the top down. Obviously, you're an example of the bottoms up as well, enabling that. But when it comes to cloud native specifically, from a technical perspective right now, what do you see as the kind of the largest risk and biggest challenge in cloud native development? So from a security perspective, what are the things that you're seeing going on where you're going, oh my gosh, this has to be fixed? It's not being fixed, but it has to be fixed. What are some of the big risks that you're seeing out there? And then I'd add to that, what are you seeing as some of the promising open source solutions that might help with some of those issues?
So I think multi-cloud is a big issue. So for example, even if you're quite proficient in AWS, if you have a Chinese customer, you might have to do Alibaba.
Right.
Some people want to use already had partnership with Microsoft or Azure, and some people already had partnership with Google. So I think the range of technologies that any like mid-sized or large company has to manage today is just increasing. And it's when I started with AWS 2008, it was basic infrastructure as a service, S3, and today I can't even mention it's like 300 different services. So I think it's just the explosion of both services and cloud providers.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. If you have a, it's not if you have a multi-cloud strategy. I have yet to talk to a security organization that's not dealing. I have not met a homogeneous. We are only this, only. It's always, oh yeah, we're 80% AWS, and right, and that's and particularly as the companies get larger and larger, as they get involved with acquisitions, as they get involved with more third parties, it expands. And the idea that you're going to have people with the skill sets that can cut across all of that, that's mythology. That's not going to happen. And increasingly finding solutions that can cut across all those becomes very difficult. So what are some of the interesting open source security solutions, or maybe if not security developer solutions, that's fine, because I know you're a developer at heart, but what are you seeing that looks promising on the horizon from an open source perspective, where it's caught your interest?
So I started to work with CFN-nag because we used to have a lot of CloudFormation, and it already had the most rules. But I think now when Bridgecrew got bought up by Palo Alto and really made a massive investment in Checkoff, there's also like infrastructure code security assessment tool.
Yes.
It already supports Terraform, CloudFormation, Azure RM, and also I think even some Google.
Yes.
So I think it's good with tools that sort of expand, so you can use one tool for many cloud providers.
I agree with that. Again, I'm not here to shamelessly plug my company, but we integrate in Checkoff amongst many others. I mean, we have a variety of solutions, but Checkoff is a really great solution. And if you can get things like Checkoff or TFSec or CFN-nag, getting those deployed across your organization, oftentimes that ends up being the challenge. How do you get that out there easily? How do you get buy-in? How do you get usage? How do you monitor it? That's the next level problem. But as a scanning solution, I think Checkoff is great. Probably the top. I think it's the top of the heap right now for sure. So I agree with you. I'll share with you one of the things that I'm interested in, just barely learning about, is like SemGrep. I think SemGrep is interesting as well. I think OPA still remains kind of interesting. I think the jury is still out a bit in terms of it being the dominant. I mean, it is the dominant policy as code. The problem is people are finding it so hard and so foreign. So Checkoff has its own policy of code. It's kind of a Python wrapper. They might be changing that a little bit. I think they're moving to more of a YAML definition in the most recent release. But again, when you look across the different players who are dealing with cloud native policy as code, you're seeing some people who've said, okay, it's going to be OPA. Some people are doing their own custom things like Checkoff. But I think those are some of the things that I find interesting. Well,
but
go ahead.
I just have one point. What I really see more in the future, or more like Bridgecrew did as well. So not just pointing out your problems, but also creating like pull requests with fixes. And you also have like Snyk, Dependabot, Renovate Bot that doing. It just help you to maintain projects by creating fixes with the pull request. And I think also JSparrow is also another in this area, but that sort of resolves known issues in your Java code.
Right.
So
I think this is a new term, I think, for security folks, not for you, but for security folks is, you're just really referring to kind of GitOps oriented solutions where they're able to integrate seamlessly with your repositories. And so they're not only scanning the repositories, but on pull requests or other sorts of changes, they're going through, they do their thing, like whatever you're working on right there, the developer's working on it in that sprint, they're coding away. And it's able to, and in the case of if it's integrated with SonarCube, able to do it right then, right there, and do the PR update. And in some cases, depending on the nature of the rule set, this is where maybe an OPA comes in. It's able to, you're able to say, hey, either we'll make a change or if it's before it gets promoted, right, in integrated in domain, we'll see it, we'll block that, right? And I do think this is the next level sort of thing for the enterprise.
Yeah, and then you also have the like security hub and auto remediations. I know Electric Eye is one open source project is quite promising as well, but I mean, then you have the problem that it's good to have auto remediation in your operations environment, but how do you then manage your configuration management and change control?
Right. Yeah.
So, because then at the end, you don't really know what's deployed and what's in your repos. Right.
No, it's very complex, but it's very promising. I was looking for, there's DevSecOps, and I seriously, I just Googled for not just GitOps, but GitSecOps just for a joke. And I actually saw that Sneak actually used that term, 2 or 3 years ago. And the reality is, I think that is kind of the, whatever we call it, you can apply a label, but the kind of Dependabot oriented integration of security that is able to not only help developers make changes in real time to reduce the amount of stuff that gets into production. It's also, less expensive, right? But also, dynamic PR requests, dynamic changes. There's some constraints. You can't just go randomly willy-nilly changing code, right? But constraints within, within changes within constraints, and then of course the policy as code as well that wraps around all of that. They can even then stop things before they promote. I do think this is all really fruitful for the future, and obviously this is where we're obviously invested. It's soluble as well. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. You had a comment?
I think when taught DevSecOps, it's really nice to see Department of Defense now. They just released the DevSecOps reference manual version 2.
Yes.
So I really liked the first one because it had a lot of good information that you could sort of take to the management, that it's not only we that trying to shift left, it's more like the general trend of the globally.
That's out of the Air Force specifically, and I'll just share with you. When I was at a global conglomerate, delivering lots of healthcare materials to the military globally, and the biggest adherent to NIST 853, all the way into the DISA STIGs, where they were going, like we're talking 1,000+ controls point by point, was the Air Force. Air Force is very, very serious about security. And I had the opportunity to actually present to the CISOs of the Air Force, Marines, Navy, and whatnot. And it's there. Obviously, needless to say, the DoD is very serious about security, and there's some good thought leadership coming out of there. So I agree with you. With that, we've gone long because you're such an interesting guy. I love seeing a leader who's right in the middle, who's committing to open source technology, who's actually integrating it with global conglomerates. You're kind of one of a kind, James, so I appreciate that. And for those of you who don't know, there was a little person in the background having a lot of fun with Minecraft. I love hearing that. That was awesome. So, hey, appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to talking to you in the near future.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Richard. It was nice to have a chat.
Likewise. So.